前はもう死んでいる。何？
This is the Greatsword. Now, the Greatsword was used second half of the 16th century, all the way through about 1750, 1760-ish in some areas of the world. His whole job is to defeat things like our polearm coming from Mr. Peasant Dead Fred over there. Now this, contrary to popular belief, only weighs about 7.5, 8 pounds. Most of his power comes from the leverage. Now this I would define as one of the most powerful swords ever developed. This one is specifically the Hanwei Lowlander sword, and no, this is not what William Wallace would have carried. As we'd mentioned before, many of these type of swords existed way past the time that William Wallace was standing around. And we can argue about that in the comments if you want. So, this type of a sword was meant primarily for people like bodyguards, the elite troops, or the Doppelsoldner in Germany. Now, Doppelsoldners, they were people that were paid double. So, double soldier, Doppelsoldner. And one of the reasons is that these guys were charged in as some of the last hope people to defeat a certain obstacle. Now, many of these swords were carried just like this by the bodyguards walking around with the lords as a way to show off. Now, this type of a sword comes in many different variations. This one is all of a straight-bladed version with a very strong ricasso there. That can be for a couple of things. Some of the manuals talk about placing one hand up on the ricasso and grabbing the other hand to treat the sword much like a very large polearm. This is what is recommended against facing a single opponent, as opposed to multiple opponents with two hands, making big long arcs, making sure that nobody can get anywhere close to you. So that way, the lord can escape, the pikemen can charge up, you can occupy a space or defend a bridge. In a situation where usually it would take a whole group of men, 5 or 6 people, you can take up the same amount of space with one of these. And these soldiers were paid exceptionally well because their job was extremely dangerous. I imagine a lot of these guys were some of the first targets for the muskets that were on the field at the time. Now, we'd mentioned it a little bit before. This type of a sword is to deal with things like polearms primarily. The group called the Forlorn Hope, the double-paid soldiers would charge out at the very beginning up against a pike block, represented here by our lovely cutting stand and Mr. Water Bottle. Now, pike blocks, obviously there's going to be a large bristling group of pikes. With these large sweeping motions, you can defend against those pikes. Fairly easy, bind up a lot of them, and then come around and charge. We talked a little bit about how to do that, and you saw some of it in the beginning here, how I primarily like to close against a pike. False edge, over the top. I think this is what's called a, something go there. I'll look up the fun name after. Come over the top, false edge, into the polearm, and then around, and you can make that big cut. There are some stories about a sword like this coming around and removing the heads off of multiple opponents. I'm not sure how true that is. But with a sword of this much power, if you're going to behead somebody, this is going to be one of your best bets, let alone multiple opponents. And now from another angle, true edge, false edge over the top to cover, true edge around to do a cut. Now with these, obviously your advantage is range. So a lot of the time, your cutting portion of the blade is all the way up here, but these can cut fairly well towards the point. Now, this type of a sword isn't the best type of cutting sword, and one of the main reasons for that is as the blade moves through the air, it will actually flex, meaning it'll twist in the air. So when that happens, it'll throw off your edge alignment very slightly when you do that. So it's very important to do big, long, swingy motions with this guy, as opposed to doing quick little snapping things like that, because it's probably not going to cut as effectively, and these little snapping things probably aren't going to be very good engaging multiple opponents. They also recommend not thrusting against multiple opponents. So, if Mr. Dead Fred is up here again, we have our pike, which can be up to like 15 feet long, which far outreaches the sword. So a lot of the time, come in, cover, grab a lot of them, come around, cover it again, and then you can make your attack. So this, we'll go ahead and do it again. I'm going to cover, whoop, on top of there with my false edge, beat the pole out of the way, sword comes up, and follow through with your whole structure rather than just your arms. Power this with your legs all the way around, come through, cut. And hopefully we've left a nice, good cut there. And it's so good, it's steaming. Now, like I said, we're facing an individual opponent. Grab it right there on the ricasso. Other end comes all the way back here and use it like a giant spear. So much like your opponent is using, you can take it and act just like a normal spear. Now, in the close game of pike and shot warfare, where these were most common in the early days, arquebuses, muskets, things like that, competing against these guys, a lot of the time you'll end up losing your weapon, or you'll get so close that this weapon will not be super good. And at this distance, now if we're here at this distance, the sword becomes pretty useless. You can use the pommel a little bit, you can kind of lever, stuff like that, but you're going to be at a huge advantage. So a lot of the time, if people got close like this, a lot of what they do is they drop their sword and draw their sidearm. Review coming soon. Same hand, kind of from behind, just like the Roman gladius. Pull it out, and you can engage your opponent. Now, let's say, whoop. Let's say we have our lovely spearmen. We've gotten super close. The pike block has charged in way too close to where I am. My sword is super useless. I let it go, which a lot of the Renaissance paintings that you'll see actually have great swords on the ground. Cover the pike as closest to me. Reach around. Grab. You have your sword, which is usually thrust-centric. Some of the Katzbalgers have a little bit of a bend in there. This one is a Swiss Degen. Cover, and then thrust. Right through the most vulnerable part of their opponent, usually in between the parts of their helmet, which is usually an open-face helmet, where you have a small nasal guard and two big gaps, aiming for the eyes at the top of the opponent. So again, clean this guy off here really quick. It's just water here in that one. Tuck it back in. Whoop. I have tossed my great sword on the ground, cover the pike to make sure that that can't offend me. Now they're going to be going for their sidearms at the same time, so you have to be very swift at this. Close, cover that, arm right here, down to your dagger, pull that out, and hopefully hit them in the face and don't miss. Thank you so much.